Dracula Chapter 18. Again, please make sure you have some colored pens ready, maybe a couple of post-its so you can make some notes. I'm not going into as much detail in these latter chapters as I have in the previous chapters, purely because I think it's now time for you to start applying some of your own independent thought. So far you've seen the detail that I expect you to be using in terms of exploration of the chapter, and I'm trusting that you now are becoming more adept at picking out specific passages or quotes and analyzing them in detail. So what happens in chapter 18? Well, Renfield seems to know about Lucy Westenra's death. Dr. Van Helsing outlines the great task that the men will have to undertake. In order to protect Mina, the men exclude her from the quest, and Renfield begs Seward to let him go. So in this chapter, we see how Mina is becoming or acting like a homemaker and providing the archetypal feminine touch to the proceedings and to the group events. So that's just something to focus on. Again, bearing in mind she is the sole female at this point, and her function is not as a voluptuous or enticing woman, but as a maternal figure. So chapter 18 starts with Dr. Seward's diary dated the 30th of September. We have Mina asking Seward if she can see Renfield. And even though he's obviously very worried about this because he's concerned that Renfield may be dangerous in the situation, may be dangerous, he does actually agree to her request. Mina is obviously very gracious with Renfield, greets him, good morning, Mr. Renfield, etc., etc. And he in turn is very, very courteous and respectful towards her, in complete opposite to the way he behaves with Seward, where he demonstrates such contempt. Okay, and it's in this section that Renfield actually describes his madness to Mina, or explains his madness, and he talks about how he consuming a multitude of living things he believes might help him indefinitely prolong his life. And again, this question arises as to what is madness, because it's clearly a social construct as to what is normality, because Renfield here appears to be very lucid, and as we go through, we'll note in some of the chapters that follow, he has terribly in-depth and philosophical conversations and arguments and debates with Seward. So we are reminded of Renfield's great intelligence. Remember, he's 59 years old, and he is an intelligent man, but it is the idea that he's considered mad. So why? And we again will look at, in another one of these talks, I will look at madness again within Victorian society. Okay, so it's clearly the idea, Renfield holds the idea that the consuming the flies and the insects and the spiders and the birds will rejuvenate and give him life. So he will take on their life force and it will extend his life. And the reason he does this is because he bases it on scripture, which says, for the blood is life. Now again, this is a distortion of the Christian ideal. Again, remember that Christ is believed to have died in order to save mankind from sin. So Christ sacrificed, he gave his blood in order to give us, or human beings, life. Now that doesn't mean that we need to consume blood. This is a metaphor, okay? And it's the idea that Christ sacrificed himself, gave of himself, died on our behalf so that we could have eternal life. So when he gives his blood, it's not, in this case, we are not supposed to partake of actual blood. So once Mina leaves, we are told that Seward goes to meet Van Helsing, and he leaves the boys behind. So note how Seward is referring to his mates Arthur and Quincy as the boys. Obviously, could be regarded as a form of male bonding. It's his gang, it's his mates. He calls them the boys, but it's also a very pertinent link to childhood attitudes and childhood ideals. This reversion to childlike behavior could be in response to Mina being in his home. Remember, I said about 2 minutes ago about how Mina is the representation of the maternal figure. She is the mum. She's making a home. She's protecting her boys, and the relationship between Mina and the other men within the group is not, again, one that can be even remotely regarded as sexual. Instead, she makes them feel comfortable enough that they feel that they can relax and they can almost revert to childhood behaviors. So Van Helsing has left to go back to Amsterdam. Has returned from Amsterdam because he went a little while back. And the first thing he does is describe Mina as having a man's brain, a brain that a man should have were he much gifted, and a woman's heart. Of course, this is high praise indeed, because it's the idea that, again, coming out of Victorian beliefs, the idea that the man has a logical, organized brain. He is not ruled by emotion. He doesn't vacillate from one feeling to another. He's controlled. Whereas Mina has that kind of analytical thinking. She's not overly emotional, but she still has a woman's heart. So she's still loving, she's still maternal, she's still capable of caring and being nurturing, which of course therefore is high praise indeed, this statement. Again, we don't look at it that way from a modern perspective, but we have to keep reminding ourselves that from within the time that this was written, this is quite a forward-thinking statement. Okay, but we're told that Mina says, Van Helsing says, friend John, up to now fortune has made that woman of help to us. So again, referring to Mina. After tonight, she must not have to do with this so terrible affair. It is not good that she run a risk so great. We men are determined, nay, are we not pledged, to destroy this monster? But it is no part for a woman. So again, it's the idea that the woman is the damsel in distress. She needs to be protected from this evil dragon. So we're again reminded of the imagery of St. George and the dragon. And again, the idea that men are stronger, men are more capable. And it's interesting because it goes on to say, if she does come along, she could suffer both in waking from her nerves and in sleep from her dreams. Now, the irony of this is that her husband has manifested these symptoms after his visit or sojourn in Transylvania. He has suffered in terms of nerves and sleep and dreams. So it begs the question, why do they regard women in this case as emotionally weaker? Obviously, and there is no question in my mind that men are, for the most part, physically stronger than women, but they aren't necessarily emotionally stronger. And I think this is an interesting statement to make, especially in light of what happened to Jonathan. And again, this is so closely linked and associated with the idea of madness within the Victorian era, and particularly within the Victorian novel. So another thing to draw your attention to is the statement that Van Helsing makes when he talks about the milk that is spilt cries not out afterwards. Again, just a reminder to us that Van Helsing is not English. He is, in fact, from Amsterdam. Again, we are looking at the idea of xenophobia. We are looking at the idea of foreigners encroaching on English soil. And again, it's interesting about which foreigners are regarded as worthy and appropriate and which foreigners aren't. We've got Van Helsing, who is extremely intelligent, and he is given the opportunity to save England, and he is part of Europe. We have Quincy, who unfortunately doesn't survive, but he is from the new world. So he's actually from a state or country that has been colonized by England. So perhaps he's got stronger ties. Pardon me. Whereas Dracula, of course, is from the East. And it's interesting, people's attitudes towards the modern West and the lacking in civilization East. So just something for us to think about there as well. We then, before that, Van Helsing retires after dinner, and he goes to read through all the papers that Mina has collated, and he says he really wants every single detail now included in this journal, including the personal little extracts. He says no matter how trivial. So now we have Mina's journal, which is dated the 30th of September, and the group are going to meet to discuss their plans going forward. Van Helsing leads the committee, and he gives a brief history of Count Dracula, and he outlines a vampire's characteristics. Now, all the details provided by Van Helsing concerning Count Dracula confirm that which has been alluded to by the narrators, all the narrators so far. So why are we backtracking? Why are we having another go over? Well, the recitation is obviously for the benefit of the characters who have not actually come across all of this, but also serves to draw together the various strands of myth and legend and history that Stoker has thus far introduced. And it also reminds us if we have forgotten of pertinent things. Again, I need to say that we are very au fait with vampire lore and these myths and legends, but when this novel was initially published, the Victorian audience would not have been, because again, Stoker is the one who has created the foundation on which we have built all our Dracula and vampire myths and lore. So this repetition is to just remind the original audience, who would not have all of this at the knowledge at the forefront of their minds, of the things that that Dracula and the vampires are able to do. So when discussing the Nosferatu, Van Helsing is like a military strategist. He brings all his knowledge together of the enemy. He's using it to support his campaign. He says the Nosferatu may be strong, but there are weaknesses that his group can exploit. Okay, and in fact, he makes an interesting statement which I do highlight for you in a little bit, that says that Dracula is in fact not free in some respects. He is more prisoner than a madman in a cell, and we'll come to that in a second. So again, we are reminded that Dracula can, within limitations, appear at will. When and where and in any of the forms that are to him, he can, within his range, direct the elements, the storm, the fog, the thunder. He can command all the meaner things, the rat, the owl, the bat, the moth, the fox, the wolf. He can grow, he can become small, he can vanish, he can become unknown. So all of these descriptions have become the basis of a vampire lore. And again, I need you to bear in mind that despite the fact that we know this would all have been very new and for first time reading to a Victorian audience. He goes on to describe vampires and Dracula as a horde and a blot on the face of God's sunshine, an arrow in the side of him who died for man. So vampires are completely ungodly, completely unnatural, and this would have resonated with an audience who tended to be more church going than we are today. Again, I'm not saying that they all believed, but it was certainly a societal norm that one went to church. Okay. So as we go on, we are informed through this that vampires are not just restricted to Transylvania. They don't just travel to England. In fact, they go so far as to be found in old Greece, old Rome, and Germany, France, India, China, the Iceland. So even the Middle East with the Magyar. So again, we've got this idea that throughout the years, this myth, this legend, throughout the centuries, has infiltrated all walks of life and doesn't just threaten English way of living, but threatens all way of living. Also interesting that it comments on religions other than Christianity, because obviously we have in old Greece and Rome, old Rome, we would have had the Roman and Greek gods, but also if the Magyar came from North Africa or Middle East, they would more likely have been Islamic. Okay, so what do the vampire live on? Well, they have a special pabulum. A pabulum means, the word means food, but it's a specific form of nourishment. So, for example, a rabbit will be eating certain greens and needs to have some particular things in its diet. In the case of the vampire, the pabulum is blood. All right. We then have another reminder about how what has happened and who has interacted and what Dracula has done, just to again reinforce his great power. So we're reminded of the lack of shadow, the lack of reflection. We're reminded that he is able to change into wolf, that he is able to command ships, etc., etc. And yet, despite all of this, so even his friend Jonathan never saw him eat. So all of this description, but despite all of this, of course, he is more prisoner than the slave of the gallery and the madman in his cell, because he has to obey certain laws. So even though he is ungodly and above nature in many things, there are certain things where he does have to obey the law. He's got to be invited in. Now, this is interesting because later there is the whole question about Mina and how does Dracula get into her room, and we will come back to that. But he has to be invited in. He cannot function as well during the day. He can only change himself at certain times. He's limited. He needs to have his coffin home. He needs to have his earth, which rejuvenates him within reach, etc., etc. So he is obviously limited, and he does have weaknesses. So Van Helsing then goes on to give us a story of how Dracula became a vampire, and he talks about the mighty Turks and the wars between them, and how the family of Dracul were Armenian, and of course Dracula is a scion. The word scion actually means an offshoot or a branch of a tree, but in this case it's used to refer to the sons of a noble family. So he's the offshoot of the offspring, the male offspring of a noble family. And the word covals is people of the same age group or contemporaries. All right. So while he's talking and telling us the story and telling the other characters as well as the reader the history, Mr. Morris, Quincy notices something at the window and gets up and leaves the room. The others don't really seem to notice this, interestingly. They are obviously very absorbed and engrossed with the story. So they've all vowed to destroy Dracula. Van Helsing obviously has listed the weaknesses. He's given historical detail. He says that they've obviously got to find and sterilize the boxes, because of course the boxes of earth are what rejuvenate Dracula. So they're going to have to go and search Carfax and find out how many boxes are left. But as obviously, while Van Helsing has been talking, Quincy snuck outside, and because he's seen something at the window, and it turns out he's seen this huge bat. And then of course we question, is it an actual bat, or of course is it Dracula? And the idea is we're supposed to believe it's Dracula, who's been sitting on the windowsill, and he shoots at the bat, because of course they don't want Dracula knowing their plans. He returns in the house. Van Helsing resumes his story and talks about the plan, and obviously tells Mina that she will be left behind for her protection. Of course, she's not that impressed by what he has said, because of course she does not think she should be left behind, but she decides she's going up to bed, and the men prepare right this moment at 4 a.m. in the morning to go to Carfax and find out what is going on and see if they can discover. So we then change narrator and we go to Seward. Obviously we have to go to Seward at this point because Mina is not does not go to Carfax, so we need to have it from his perspective. And interestingly, just as the men are preparing to go, Seward receives a missive from Renfield demanding to see him. So instead of just him going all for tootle along to visit Renfield, and Renfield begs and begs and begs, please, I need to be released in order to save my soul. But the guys refuse to free him or to give him his wish. And Renfield turns around and says, you gentlemen who by nationality, by hereditary, or by the possession of natural gifts are fitted to hold your respective places in the moving world. So again, just a reminder, Renfield is extremely lucid, extremely intelligent, okay? And he makes a very important or very revealing statement, because not only does this show his lucidity, but it is also the view of any sane person of the late Victorian era who may have thought of these men, because it doesn't matter, they're born into what they have, their place, whether it's by nationality, whether by hereditary, or whether because they have these gifts, they are born into their position. And again, because of his amazing lucidity, we are required to question what is madness. Okay. So as they turn to leave, all right, Seward turns back and notices a change comes over the patient. He says, he moved towards me so quickly that for a moment I feared he was about to make another homicidal attack. My fears, however, were groundless, for he held up his two hands imploringly and made his petition in a moving manner. Okay, and they deny him. And when he leaves the room, Renfield's parting shot is, you will, I trust, Dr. Seward, do me the justice to bear in mind later on that I did what I could do to convince you tonight. So we, the reader, are going, for goodness sake, why are you not listening to this man? They still do not seem to have made the major leap and link between Renfield and Dracula. So chapter 18 is a key chapter, obviously, in this novel, because Stoker for the first time gives his definition of what a vampire is. He outlines their supernatural powers, he talks about their strengths, and of course he talks about how vampires can be trapped and how vampires can be eliminated. And obviously all subsequent stories about vampires, or Dracula himself, use Stoker's parameters, even if they are to debunk Stoker's parameters. So the garlic, the crucifix, the wooden stake, the holy wafers, etc. And it's this chapter that not only gives us all this detail, but is also come to define what we call vampire literature.